Hey there. So today we're diving into something, well, it hits close to home for a lot of us, especially here in Northeast England. We're talking about PTSD support. And, you've all sent in some really thought-provoking articles and guides. I'm quite eager to get into it.
Yeah, it's definitely a topic that, well, it deserves our attention, wouldn't you say? And the material you've gathered, it offers a really comprehensive look at not just the struggles, but more importantly, the support that's available right here in our region.
Exactly. And, one thing that really jumped out at me right off the bat was this statistic. It's pretty startling when you think about it. PTSD rates in Northeast England, they're higher, significantly higher than the national average, which is
Yeah, it's quite a difference.
7 to 10% here. That's a lot of people, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And, the sources, they don't give us an exact national average to compare to, but just that figure alone, 7 to 10%, it really makes you pause and think like, what's going on here in the Northeast? What's contributing to this? And it seems like it's not just one single thing. The sources point to this, well, almost like a perfect storm of different factors, historical, social, even economic elements, all kind of intertwined.
That is fascinating. It's not like you can't just point to one thing and say that's the cause, right?
Yeah.
There's like this complex way. So tell me more about these historical, social, economic elements that the sources highlight. What are some of the things that they're talking about?
Well, I mean, for one thing, the Northeast, we have this rich industrial past, shipyards, mines, you name it. But that kind of history, it often comes at a cost, right? Think about it. Mining accidents, disasters in the shipyards, these events, they didn't just claim lives, they shook entire communities. And the thing is, the psychological scars, even generations later, they can be really significant.
It makes you think about the lasting impact of that kind of collective trauma, right, on an entire community.
Exactly.
And it's not just these large-scale events, right?
Yeah.
The sources also talk about the pandemic and its role in all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. The pandemic, it really kind of, I think it underscored just how widespread trauma can be and how deeply it can impact people, even for those who didn't, experience a direct loss during that time. The constant fear, the isolation, the disruption to everyday life, all of it took a toll on people's mental well being. And the sources seem to suggest that, well, we might be seeing some of that reflected in these rising PTSD rates.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that trauma can really stem from such a wide range of experiences. It's not just the things that we traditionally think of as traumatic. And it really highlights the need for accessible mental health support, especially here in the Northeast. But before we get into the specifics of what that support looks like, I think it's important to understand the full impact of PTSD, not just on individuals, but on families, on communities. Because it's not just an individual struggle, is it?
You're absolutely right. The sources are very clear about that. PTSD, it has this ripple effect. Imagine, living with someone who's constantly on edge, struggling with sleep, maybe even withdrawing emotionally. It's going to impact relationships, family dynamics, just the overall well-being of everyone involved.
It's like this weight that everyone ends up carrying,
Yeah,
even if they didn't personally experience the trauma firsthand.
exactly.
It's a lot. And we can't forget the economic burden either. If someone's struggling with PTSD, it can affect their work, their ability to hold down a job. And that leads to financial strain, not just for the individual, but for their entire family. It's a cycle. It's hard to break free. Now, I know we've been talking about the statistics, the ripple effects, and it can feel kind of heavy. But it's not all doom and gloom. The sources do highlight a range of support options that are available right here in the Northeast. And they specifically talk about trauma-focused therapies. Now, to be honest, when I first read that phrase, I was a little intimidated. It sounds kind of intense. But as I was reading more, I started to feel a glimmer of hope.
Oh, there's definitely hope. A lot of it. It's not just about managing the symptoms. It's about getting to the root of the problem, addressing the root cause. These therapies, they empower people to actually process that traumatic event, challenge those negative thought patterns, and most importantly, develop healthy coping mechanisms. And the sources, they dive into two really prominent examples: cognitive processing therapy, or CPT, and then there's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is, well, it's a mouthful, EMDR.
Okay, I have to admit, even the acronyms sound a little intense, so let's break them down a bit.
Yeah.
CPT and EMDR, what are they and what makes them so unique?
All right, so imagine your mind is like a computer. When you experience trauma, it's like your program gets stuck in this loop, right? Replaying these negative thoughts and emotions over and over. CPT, it's like having a skilled technician come in, identify that harmful code, and help you rewrite it.
So it's about reframing those negative thought patterns, the ones that are so deeply ingrained because of the trauma.
Exactly. It helps people see those thoughts for what they are, a byproduct of the trauma, not necessarily accurate reflections of reality. And that's so important. It's about empowering them to challenge those thoughts, those deeply held beliefs, and replace them with more balanced, healthy perspectives.
Okay, that's really interesting, like rewiring the neural pathways, so to speak.
Exactly.
So what about EMDR? That one always sounds, well, even more intriguing to me, maybe because of the whole eye movement thing.
It does, doesn't it? It sounds very, well, active in a way, but it's actually grounded in some fascinating neuroscience. The basic idea is that when we recall a traumatic memory, sometimes our brains, they get stuck, just like that computer program we talked about. EMDR helps us process and unstick those memories, so to speak.
Okay, so it's almost like hitting the reset button on those traumatic memories, right?
Exactly. It's like creating a safe space for your brain to reprocess those memories. You're focusing on a specific aspect of the traumatic memory while you're tracking the therapist's finger movements, right? It could be side to side eye movements, tapping, or even listening to alternating sounds.
Wait, so you're essentially guiding the brain to process the memory differently through these external cues. It's
Yeah.
like you're gently nudging it in a healthier direction. That's incredible.
Yeah. It is pretty amazing, isn't it, how the brain responds to this kind of intervention. And the research, well, it backs it up. Studies suggest that EMDR can be incredibly effective, especially for single event traumas, like a car accident or a natural disaster.
That's remarkable. It's like EMDR provides this shortcut to healing that traditional talk therapy might take much longer to achieve.
In a way, yes, it can help people process traumatic memories more rapidly and effectively, reducing their emotional intensity and allowing for healthier coping mechanisms to emerge. The sources even highlight the story of a PTSD survivor here in the Northeast, Sarah, who found significant relief through EMDR.
I'd love to hear more about Sarah's experience. These real-life stories are so powerful.
Absolutely. She shared, and I quote, EMDR has been life-changing. It's helped me to finally process the trauma that I've been carrying for years, and for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm actually moving forward.
Wow, that's incredible. It's a real testament to the power of these therapies and a beacon of hope for others who might be struggling. It's not just theoretical, it's making a tangible difference in people's lives. But Sarah's story brings up another question. The sources mentioned a few other therapies besides CPT and EMDR, right? What about those?
You're right, they do. We've been focusing on those too, but another one that often comes up in PTSD treatment is exposure therapy.
Exposure therapy. That one, I'll admit, sounds a bit intimidating, even to me.
It can sound intense, yes, but it's important to remember that it's always done in a safe, controlled, and gradual way, and it can be incredibly effective. Imagine, for instance, someone who experienced a traumatic car accident and now avoids driving altogether. With exposure therapy, they would work with their therapist to gradually confront their fear of driving. They'd start with small steps, like sitting in a parked car, then progress to short drives, and eventually build up to longer distances.
So it's about facing those fears head on, but with expert guidance and at a pace that feels manageable for the individual. It's about reclaiming those aspects of life that trauma has taken away.
Exactly. And the sources actually highlight a fantastic example of exposure therapy being offered right here in the Northeast, in County Durham. They even quote a local resident who found remarkable success through this type of therapy. He shared, exposure therapy wasn't easy, but with the support of my therapist, I was able to confront my fears and regain a sense of control over my life. It's given me my life back.
Another story of resilience and hope. It's so inspiring to see how these therapies are empowering people in the Northeast to heal and move forward. But I know the sources also delved into a specific group deeply affected by PTSD veterans. It feels incredibly important to dedicate time to understanding their unique experiences and the tailored support they need.
You're absolutely right. The unique challenges veterans face are incredibly important to address. The sources make it clear that veterans often experience PTSD at higher rates than the general population, and their trauma often stems from combat, witnessing horrific events, or enduring prolonged periods of stress and danger.
And those experiences can leave invisible scars that run deep. It's not just about the physical wounds of war, but the mental and emotional ones as well.
Precisely, and those require specialized care. That's why it's so encouraging that here in the Northeast, there's a real recognition of the need for targeted PTSD treatment for veterans. It's not about a one-size-fits-all approach, but about understanding the nuances of their experiences and tailoring therapies to address their specific needs.
So it's about creating a safe space where veterans feel seen, heard, and understood, where they can process those experiences without judgment.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that their journey is distinct and requires a targeted approach. Beyond the therapies we've discussed, like CPT and EMDR, which can be adapted for combat-related trauma, the sources emphasize the value of support groups and online forums specifically for veterans. These platforms offer a sense of camaraderie and shared understanding that can be incredibly healing.
That sense of community and shared experience can be incredibly powerful, especially when you're dealing with something as isolating as PTSD. It's like, you get me, you understand what I'm going through.
Yeah.
Are there any particular organizations or resources mentioned in the sources that offer these types of support groups for veterans here in the Northeast? It is so important, that sense of community, especially when you're dealing with something like PTSD, which can be so isolating.
It really can.
So did the sources point to any specific organizations here in the Northeast that are doing this well, offering these kinds of support groups?
Yeah, actually, there was one that stood out. It's called the NHS Northeast Veteran Recovery College. It's run by the Anxious Minds charity. And it sounds like a really, really fantastic resource, especially for veterans who are transitioning back to civilian life while also, dealing with PTSD or other mental health challenges.
That's great to hear that there are those specialized resources. Now, speaking of the NHS, what role does it play more broadly in providing PTSD support here in the Northeast?
Well, the NHS it's absolutely vital in making sure that everyone, no matter who they are, no matter what their background is, can access mental health care. And that includes PTSD treatment, of course. They offer a whole range of services from therapy to support groups to specialized programs. And, what's really encouraging is they seem really committed to making sure that veterans don't fall through the cracks. They even mention that veterans can connect with mental health services through their GP, which is huge, just in terms of making it easier to navigate what can sometimes feel like a really complicated system.
That's reassuring to hear, that there are those clear pathways to support. It makes a huge difference when you're dealing with so much already. And I love that they emphasize tailored care for veterans because, as we were saying, their needs are so specific.
Absolutely. And I think what's so striking about the NHS's approach, at least here in the Northeast, is the acknowledgement that PTSD is complex. There's no single solution. So they offer this diverse toolkit to try to address the needs of each person, which I think is really, really crucial.
I agree. It speaks to the complexity of it. Okay,
Mm.
so we've really covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We talked about the fact that PTSD rates are higher here in the Northeast. We looked at how PTSD impacts not just individuals, but families and entire communities. And then we explored all these different therapies, CPT, EMDR, exposure therapy. We even talked about the specific needs of veterans. It's been quite a journey, wouldn't you say?
It really has. It's been, a lot to process, I think. But,
Yeah.
even though some of the statistics, some of the stories that we've encountered can be really heavy, really difficult, I think it's important to end on a note of hope.
Mhm.
Because the sheer variety of resources that are available here in the Northeast and the dedication to supporting those with PTSD, it's truly, truly inspiring.
I wholeheartedly agree. And I think that's a great note to, almost end on. But before we wrap up completely, any final thoughts for our listener out there? Something to leave them pondering, as they kind of continue to explore this topic, this complex topic.
One thing that really struck me as we were talking is just the power of awareness, the power of destigmatization. And the sources really emphasize this. The importance of talking openly about PTSD, creating a culture where people who are struggling feel comfortable coming forward and asking for help. That's where real change starts, I think.
It's not just about having the resources, it's about making sure people feel safe to actually access them.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And that change, it can start small. It could be as simple as educating yourself about PTSD or being an empathetic listener to someone who's sharing their story, or even just advocating for better mental health support in your own community. Every little bit counts.
Absolutely. Every action, no matter how small, it makes a difference. To all of you listening, whether PTSD affects you personally or someone you love, take a moment. What's one small action that you can take today? What can you do to make a difference? And on that note, this has been our deep dive into PTSD support in Northeast England.
It's been a privilege exploring these sources with you.
Until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep the conversation going.